So I won't explain deep uranium right now. I did get a lot of information from deep uranium about Ukraine and about how the Pakistani ISI was being used for transport and logistics of this material, of the stolen material. I did get a lot of information from him. Again, he may be discredited. So, you know, he was an FBI informant. He was in the CIA, is in cutouts that may have been contractors to the CIA for the movement of these materials across the stands, from it not going to not leaving the Russia when we decommissioned the 20,000 nuclear warheads at the end of the Cold War, not leaving there and going to Piketon, Ohio to be downblended. It stayed in Ukraine. It was meted out slowly through PAC-ISI, developed the Pakistani nuclear program, it developed the Indian nuclear program, it developed the South African nuclear program, it developed the Iranian nuclear program, it developed the Iraqi nuclear program, it developed the Libyan nuclear program, the French nuclear program, the British nuclear program, the German nuclear program, all these programs that Kissinger was involved in development. But it stayed in Ukraine, and that's why Ukraine is the key here. That's why having a place that gets a lot of money, gets a lot of funding. Remember, since IMF recognition in 2002, it's getting into the hundreds of billions of dollars now, I believe. The last one that Bill Taylor was so interested in was the $17 billion tranche. There's an article in Zero Hedge today talking about $1 billion in USAID in 2014, another $1 billion in 2015, and another $1 billion in 2016 that the Bidens were involved in. That is chump change. That is chump change. We said it was Fiona Hill. We said she was OCONUS lures. We said it was USAID. We said it was Chemonics. We described exactly how that happened. That is chump change. The real action is diverting this money for Ukraine into weapons. We must have covered this 2.5 years ago, but through Bijan Khan, through Dilyana, discovering all these weapons caches areas, through Azerbaijan, through Silkway Airlines, through copious amounts of data where all these flights for all this weapons all over Africa. So we're connecting the dots on that. The $3 billion for the Bidens, chump change. It's the IMF money that was diverted. Remember what Bill Taylor did. He has done in every job he's ever been in. Energy security. He goes from country to country to country after the topple, after the initial footprint of the overthrow, and he goes in and does recognition, and he makes sure that the oil, gas, and uranium interests are taken care of for the consortium. That's going to be the answer to the test. I'm not saying the USAID isn't also positive metadata. It outs Fiona Hill at Chemonics. He, Zero Hedge today talks about these zero doc USAID tranches of $1 billion a pop. No, it comes with a big documentation package when you're putting out $1 billion. In 2014, 15, and 16, we had no docs, like no doc loans we used to have that caused the mortgage crisis. We actually had no doc USAID. We've been talking about this no doc USAID thing literally for 3 years with Rajiv Shah when he took over as a 37-year-old of USAID. We've been talking about it for 3 years. It is important to establish metadata, but the dog in this fight is the IMF money. The IMF money. We just sat with all the IMF ministers up close and personal last week at the White House. So it is going to be the answer to the test. I'm going to leave it right there. I know this is a lot of information. I know it's complex. This whole idea of international net assessment, war gaming, nuclear war gaming, the whole idea of weapons and diversion of the nuclear money, using the nuclear scare to get the money to then divert it to covert operations. I know all that's difficult and complex, but it is the answer to the test. That's the important piece. And it's keeping that business going, that covert weapons going, keeping that covert server humming in the White House with obstructions. That's the name of the game, and that's why Trump is getting the resistance he is. And that's very important to understand for the jury and the American people, and the senators are going to be voting on this soon, so it's very important for them to understand as well. And if you look at his two sons, if you look at the two sons of Taylor, it's a similar story. one's involved, Chris Taylor is involved in doing centrifuges and weapons balancing for torpedoes, for General Dynamics, and also missiles. And then the other is involved in sort of satellite interpretation, amongst other things, big data interpretation and using predictive analytics. So we're going to leave it right there. But it is important. Motive is important, understanding where people are coming from, what their fathers did, if they went in their father's footsteps or they didn't. The Z Society, a lot of people are talking about the Z Society, which predates the Z Division. If you look back to the original Z Society, it was this cadre of militaristic Krupp-like Germans that created a secret society going all the way back to the turn of the century, looking for molybdenum for the cannons, for the lining of the cannons, so the cannons wouldn't overheat with repeated firing. That same group is a recruiting pool. This is where Otto Warmbier comes into the story with North Korea being a go-between for a spy go-between for North Korea. If you remember, you're German. Sieben is the number for 7. I believe it's the 7 because there's also a 7 Society. 7 Society at University of Virginia is much more secretive. I believe Woodrow Wilson was in there. But you have a lot of people in the 7 Society that were heads of CIA and planners and directors of plans at CIA boards every year. It's going to be the answer to the test where a lot of these recruits, the ones that are on the ends, but it is Sieben, it is 7, and we'll leave it right there. And if you don't believe me, you can go to the Ukrainian Business Council at 555 Washington Street, a block from the White House, and ask Bill Taylor yourself. And I will need to go now.